There is nothing wrong with your television. We are controlling transmission. You are about to experience the awe and mystery which reaches from the inner mind to Brunswick Area Television.
I've got a job to do today.
I've got a job to do today.
Have a good first day at work, Mom.
Your donations to Goodwill fund job training programs right in your community.
Feels good to start fresh, right?
Sure does.
And like that, you're a job creator.
Welcome to this month's Salute to Service, and with me this month I have Major Retired David Sears. Dave, I want to welcome you to the show. Long-time Medina resident, correct?
Correct.
And you retired from the military in what year?
1993.
So just tell me, let's go back a little bit and talk about you and how you got into the military and when you went in and some things like that.
Being an old West Virginia native and growing up in the 50s and the early 60s in my hometown in West Virginia, that coincided with the beginning of the Vietnam War. And as I was graduating high school in 1966, I had my father and my uncle, who were both World War II veterans, and several of the members in town who knew about me and my family. And they said, well, what do you plan to do? And I said, well, I'm going to college, going to West Virginia University, and my plan at this point is to do some military service. And I said, I would like to do the service going through the Reserve Officer Training Corps program, ROTC. And they said, well, what if things get so bad that they draft you? And I said, well, I'll plan, I'll go forward, and we'll see where we go. And if I get a draft notice before I get a commission, then we comply with what we're doing. And that's where it went.
So you got commissioned in what year?
I got commissioned in 1971 from West Virginia University.
Into which branch?
I was commissioned field artillery, U.S. Army.
There you go. So you went down to Fort Sill for some training and stuff like that?
I didn't do much training.
No?
They said, Vietnam is winding down. We no longer need forward observers. What else would you like to do? And I said, I have a real hankering for computers. And they said, well, the Adjutant General Corps has computers at this point in time, and we're going to send you to Fort Benjamin Harrison to become an Adjutant General Corps officer, and then you're going to go to computer school.
So you got to go work in that big building out there in Indiana somewhere.
There's the big finance building,
right.
Still the biggest building in the U.S. Army inventory, but it was an adjacent building. It was on the post, but it was a different building, Gates Lord Hall.
So you went right in at the tail end of Vietnam, and then you wound up retiring in '93.
That's correct.
Huge difference between the United States Army in 1971 and 1993. Would you agree, or?
I would agree. When I went in, we still had the active draft. We still had active duty unit members who were receiving orders to report to Vietnam. And we kept looking at when's our turn coming up. And as things progressed and the politics of the situation went on, it happened that they said, we're winding down, there's a termination date, and the last date for U.S. troops, as I recall, was March 31st of 1973.
So how did, once the Vietnam War ended and those troops were coming home, though, how did you see, I mean, I was still in high school then, but I remember the country and how the military was viewed, which is a whole nother topic. But how did you see that transition on how the Army and the military started to change into becoming the force it was in the 90s when you got out?
Well, my perspective of it was, as a second lieutenant, I was dealing with sergeants, and specialists, E4s, who had been drafted for the most part, and they had been drafted with the intention of being sent to Vietnam. And they went, they did their time, they came back, and they were just waiting for their expiration of term of service, their ETS,
Yeah.
so they could go home.
Yeah. It's a big difference, I think, between the, you know, not to take anything away from anybody, but between a draft Army, the conscripted, and the all-volunteer force. And you know, we can throw around which one's different and everything else, but a lot of people would say today that the draft adds something back to the American citizens because it kind of puts a little more meat into it. If your son or daughter are drafted, like with the current wars, less than 1%, I think it is has a connection to that military. So that's a big difference.
That's a big difference.
Yeah.
And
Well-
1973, if I can add, was a little pivotal there in that June 30th was the end of the draft for the U.S. military. And then some of the programs of trying to do retention was the VOLAR, Volunteer Army, in which they tried to provide funding to make the barracks dress up better, give the soldiers individual cubicles instead of being in open bay areas, and this type of thing.
Yeah. So when you were serving, you wound up going over to Europe though for a brief time. How long were you over in Europe?
3.5 years.
And where at?
Most of it, Heidelberg.
Heidelberg. That's a nice place.
It's a nice place.
So you've seen the college or the castle burn
University,
or whatever, and the college and all that.
The Schloss.
Yeah, beautiful place. So after you come back from Germany, what did you wind up doing the rest of your career in the military mostly?
Attending career course and then ending up being at some installations, brigade adjutant at a quartermaster institution, being at Fort Benning, Georgia, working personnel.
Paratrooper school?
The entire installation. There was a period of time there where I was the chief of the Milpo as a captain.
What year were you in Europe?
1973 to 1977.
So, and I know I went over to Europe in the 80s, and there was a transition going on over there with drugs and everything else, and that was, you know, the time when they were starting to get really strict on drug use and stuff. But there was a big segregation problem within the military back then, especially in Europe, from what we were told prior to us coming in. And did you see any of that, or?
In the early 1970s, there were some serious race issues, as were told to us. By the time I'd gotten there in 1973, the Women Army Corps had been integrated into the rest of the military services and was no longer a separate corps.
Right.
And there was a lot of effort put in to make certain that the racial issues were addressed, and I never experienced any issues with that.
No, that's a good thing. And so you come back from Europe, and then where did you go then? Fort Benning?
Went to Fort Benjamin Harrison, Indiana. Did some schooling there, then ended up going to Fort Lee, Virginia. Spent about 3 years there. Went to Fort Benning, spent 3 years there. Ended up with 3rd U.S. Army, which in mobilization terms is called Army Central Command, ARCENT,
Right.
which is the ground force in the Middle East right now. And in those 3 years, we did a lot of staff work, and we did a lot of travel, a lot of exercising, field training exercises. Ended up one summer spending that time in Egypt, and other times working with them. We had a training session in California, and they brought in general officers of many of the Middle Eastern nations.
Wow.
And that was the first time I had seen a general officer from the United Arab Emirates. And they had Egyptian generals. And being that ARCENT, Army Central Command, is also the name for 3rd U.S. Army, Patton's old army, the Egyptian 3rd Army at that time was our counterpart in the Middle East.
Yeah, it's funny when like I said, when I enlisted, most of my senior NCOs were all Vietnam veterans, and I remember, you know, there was a period where all the Vietnam veterans were kind of going. They were like my platoon sergeant, my first sergeant. They were starting to retire, but I still recall when I went back to Afghanistan and Iraq, there was things that those guys taught me that you used once you went into a combat situation, that they had kind of instilled in you. And some of that got lost during that peacetime army, as you want to call it, from the 80s and the 90s there, until we went back to combat. And I'm sure some people recall things that they learned from Vietnam veterans that were in the service from years ago, and we're probably still doing those things today. So when you got out, you retired in '93, and you kind of got a different story here. You didn't come out and become a civilian and go on to a different career. You kind of maintained what you were doing. Tell me a little bit about that.
I looked around at what was available, and I thought I would work with the automation arena, which I'd been an information technician for a military police command. And things were getting kind of tight. There was a recession happening then. And one of my associates said, "Have you heard about junior ROTC?" And that's ROTC programs in high schools. And I took that one and I went and investigated, and they said, "Guess what? You're stationed in Detroit and you're going to be retiring from here. We have 3 openings in Ohio. We had 1 in Akron and 2 in Columbus." And one of the individuals at Fort Knox, who was also retired but working with the junior program, said, "Why don't you go to Akron and take a look at that school?" And I came to Akron, and there were 2 retired first sergeants already on board. And of course, they gave me the good show, showing me everything positive. The principal was anxious to have an officer on board to be the senior Army instructor. And they said, "If you take it, you got it." And
You never look back.
I never looked back. I wore the same uniform. Actually, at the time of my separation, when I took my active duty ID card to get a retiree ID card, I went and bought 2 new Class A uniforms.
There you go. And so you spent 20 years doing that, and then you wound up retiring from junior ROTC, which was a program that was expanding huge in the 90s. I know the president expanded junior ROTC quite a bit in 93, 94, 95. There was some expansions there.
And if I can add to that, Ohio was one of those of congressional interest. When I retired, there were 7 Army junior ROTC programs in the state of Ohio. When I retired, there were 21.
When you retired from junior ROTC?
When I retired from the junior ROTC position, there were 21 Army programs.
I think it was, I don't know if it was President Bush or President Clinton. I remember when they expanded that, and they were looking at inner city schools and going into, because a lot of the junior ROTCs were in rural areas back at that point. And that's when they started to focus on the inner city schools.
Yes, they wanted to focus on students more at risk.
Yeah.
And they wanted us to come in and show stability, that we were in uniform, we're still wearing our military uniforms, and our curriculum was provided by the U.S. Army, and it was to teach citizenship skills to the young folks.
A lot of people get that confused. Junior ROTC and ROTC at the colleges is 2 completely separate programs. I mean, a lot of people think that, well, if you're in junior ROTC, you're going to go into the military or you're automatically fed into ROTC. And that's, I mean, a lot of guys and girls do enlist from junior ROTC, but it is not a military feeder program by no means. It is there to teach citizenship, unlike if you're in ROTC in college, then you are going to go into the military 90% of the time, just the way those scholarships work and everything. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. Specifically, we were not to be identified as a recruiting tool for the military services.
Right.
But I'd like to add to that, that our students who expressed an interest in military service, we also opened that door to all service recruiters, all services, Army, Air Force, Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard.
It wasn't just strictly Army. Yeah.
It was not strictly Army.
So let's back up to you getting out a little bit, though. How do you feel on the last day of your service when you're getting ready to retire and you're handing your walk paper? We all know what the last day in a unit's like, and you're moving on to another unit. But when you retire, or when you get out, even if you're not retired, and when it's the last day, it's a little bit different. How did you feel?
I had a feeling of it's almost the same, and since I had a job already waiting for me. But the difference was I had a retiree ID card versus an active duty green card. And it's, well, now I'm not subject to recall. Now I'm going to plant roots and I will not be moving in 3 or 4 years.
That's a little different. You got to wash the windows now, right?
Now you have to wash the windows and you have to plan where to put the shrubs around the house because you're going to have to tend them for a long time.
And we're glad you've been tending them. You've been here now in Medina for
21 years.
There you go. So you also do some work down with the National Cemetery in Rittman, the Ohio Western Reserve National Cemetery. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yes. My membership, to get into that, well, actually I started through the Military Officer Association of America. I became a member of that chapter, and part of that was because they presented awards to some of my junior ROTC cadets. And I said, well, they're giving me something, let me give something back to them. And then as I became involved with that chapter, the Ohio Western Reserve chapter, they also said, you know, we are allocated 2 members on the Ohio Western Reserve National Cemetery Advisory Committee. And you live in Medina, which is fairly close. Would you care to represent us there? And I said, certainly. So I showed up for a couple of meetings, and then there was a time where the treasurer who had been in that position had some medical issues and had to give up that position, and they elected me into it, and that's been almost 5 years now.
And so what does the advisory council do down there at the cemetery? And we had, you know, I know we had a couple months back, we had the director on here, and we walked around the cemetery, and we never really talked a lot about what that advisory, but from your standpoint, what does the advisory council do at the cemetery? Because they're an all volunteer force.
It's all volunteer and it's all veterans, and it's male, female, and it's from all conflicts. And even in those eras when there was no conflict, we take the membership from any veteran.
So what do they advise the director and the cemetery staff on, though?
At the inception of this cemetery, they gave suggestions for naming the streets. They were given the VA guidelines of what the VA people wanted to do, and then they looked at it, and they were asked their opinions about these things, and they worked together and came up with a solution and said, you know, this looks good, and everyone here would support that. There's a very distinct line, though, in that this is a veterans non-governmental agency. We are veterans, but we are not government employees. And the other people who work there are all members of the Veterans Administration. There are a couple of ceremonies, specifically Memorial Day, which is a Veterans Administration function. They perform that one. And they come up with guest speakers and what they want to do for the itinerary. The advisory committee specifically takes over the Veterans Day ceremony. And our committee comes up with recommending guest speakers, masters of ceremony, individuals to do the pieces of the ceremony, such as presentation of the colors, the honor guard, firing of the rounds, and occasionally construction of the Soldiers' Monument. What I personally see is that those of us who are the volunteers on this advisory committee, we go back to our own posts. Our membership covers all of the counties of Northeast Ohio, and we have members from every kind of veterans organization. And we take the information we get and take it back to our home veterans groups. So we disseminate the information.
Now, you had mentioned a little bit earlier that you're a member of MOAA, which is Military Officers Association of America. And it's a little known association. It's not as big as the American Legion or the VFW or DAV, but it's every bit as important. Tell me a little bit about the membership of MOAA and what their focus is, because every group has their own focus. What's the focus of MOAA?
Well, with MOAA, the criteria to be a member is to have ever been a commissioned officer of the United States government. And that includes the military services, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and it also includes commissioned officers of the Public Health Service and the National Oceanographic Atmospheric Administration, NOAA.
So, you know, it's, even being a small organization, they are very powerful, being that they have a lot of ex-officers in their group. And I know they lobbied heavily last year when, you know, they were trying to take away retirements and stuff like that when Congress was trying to cut that. So, I mean, there's a big push in Washington from MOAA to do right by the veterans and retirees and stuff.
At the national level, MOAA is considered a lobby organization. Right. At the local chapter level, we still try to maintain that tax exempt status, right, like a 501c3, and we don't become political, but we can deal with our congressional and state representatives.
So now you guys meet, what, once a month?
For our chapter, yes, we meet once a month.
Where do you meet at?
Usually at Anthony's Prime 93, but we pick different restaurants or meeting agendas in the area, because our area covers about 5 counties.
So 21 years in the military obviously molds and shapes a person into, you know, their character and their being. And I know, you know, your after career, you went on and were kind of almost still in the military, wearing the uniform out there every day with our young men and women in high school. But in your private life, how do you think the military has shaped you as the man you are today, you know, with your character and maybe your decision-making process and your ethics? And how does what the military made you guide you day to day?
My military service emphasized on me the absolute requirement of total integrity in what you do. You do not make false statements or submit false documents for any type of activity. So that integrity, which gives you the honesty that when someone hears you say something, they can believe you and know that it's going to be done. The other thing about military service, it made me focus a lot more on attention to detail. And this is where, when you start with a project or a mission or a goal, that you plan how you're going to accomplish that, and you go through the process of checking your progress in this procedure. And in the old days, they used to call it the old PERT test, you know, Program Evaluation Review Technique. And you go and you check yourself, which takes you out of the flow. You have to sit back and think about this. And it's a conscious thing. So occasionally now I get that conscious meditation and look at where I'm going, what I'm doing, make sure I'm still on track. Some of the things that came along where you meet all types of individuals, all types of personalities, both as superiors, peers, and subordinates. And the one thing that always stuck with me was that those that I most enjoyed working around were the ones who could be mentors and train and encourage and be positive influences. And that made me want to be more like that. And I think that is where I really jumped into the opportunity to become a teacher and take the junior ROTC position.
So obviously your character and your dedication to the military and our nation is carried on, because you have how many children in the military, or have been in the military now?
I've two children who have been in the military and have deployed during the current conflicts in the Middle East.
So, I mean, they get that from you, I would assume. I mean, you know.
I would think so, yes.
Any last thoughts that you would give? I mean, obviously working with kids for so many years and being in the military, any last thoughts that you would pass on to someone that's maybe thinking about joining the military, or maybe thinking about getting into junior ROTC or ROTC, on you know, how you would feel about that?
I would totally support it. And if you live in a school district that does not offer the junior ROTC programs, the alternatives could be Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, Civil Air Patrol, which is an Air Force auxiliary.
Which we have right here in Medina County too.
We have one in Medina County. And Young Marines, and I think Sea Cadets has a program.
Sea Cadets has one close. There's one in Cleveland that supports Medina County also, and Young Marines out of Brook Park.
If I can add to that though, but many of these programs, upon advancement in the rank of that particular activity, will give you an opportunity for accelerated advancement in a service if you do enlist in a service.
There you go. Yeah, I know you're big in MOA and stuff, but do you belong to some other organizations too, or?
Yes, I do.
Which one?
I've been a longtime member of the American Legion, and I felt an obligation to join them because many years ago, my local hometown post sent me to Mountaineer Boys State in West Virginia,
Wow.
which is the counterpart to the Buckeye Boys State here. So I joined the American Legion post, and after a few years, I became post commander for 2 years. So you join, and you do have opportunities for progression.
And currently you're teaching at Akron U you teach land navigation?
I teach land navigation for students at the University of Akron. And just to counter that one, I also work at my church preschool. And I am the lunch bunch grandpa.
That is a great job too, I'm sure. After dealing with high school kids and soldiers, the lunch bunch grandpa is probably...
That's refreshing because it's an opportunity to try to set an example for these young folks who are 3 and 4 and 5 years old. And
that's where it begins.
That's where it begins.
You can never start too early. So I always ask everybody the one question that comes on this show: if you had to do it all over again, would you go back and do the military and give back to your country like you did, or?
Back again? Absolutely.
If they called you today, would you call? Would you go?
Actually, I tried to in 2004, and they said, no, you're too old.
All right. Dave, I want to thank you for coming on the show. Obviously, a lifelong dedication to the United States Army and to those in junior ROTC, and still giving back to the community here. And I want to thank you for coming on the show.
My pleasure.
Thank you. We'll see you next month on Salute to Service.
While I was in the military, I served my country. I did my job, but as a veteran with a disability, I was worried about my career prospects. After my traumatic brain injury, Voc Rehab helped me roll up my sleeves and get back to work.
Made me realize that I could plant a beautiful garden for my community center.
Took my professional development to the next level with vocational counseling and education.
Showed me a bright future, even though my sight was damaged in combat.
Elevated my career, even though a back injury prevented me from doing heavy lifting.
Prepared me for my next mission and helped me realize that success after the service is possible.
If your service-connected disability prevents you from continuing in your civilian career, Voc Rehab offers counseling, training with a living allowance, education, and other services to help prepare you for your next mission.